So, what's my worldview and how do I know it? We used to ask that as a question in our art of hosting trainings. And what's your worldview and how do you know it? And it'd be like deer in the headlights. People will go, never thought about it. I don't know. What is my worldview really? And how do I know? And that became really the core part of my PhD dissertation is how do we know what our worldview is? In the academic languages, how can we deconstruct it in a way that's helpful to us, but also helpful to others? And so we work with a framework that was developed by a Belgian philosopher called Leo Apostel. He's since passed away. There are a number of frameworks out there, but what we like about Apostles is it has six components to a worldview. Some of them had 9 components, 14 components, 20 components. I can't remember all that. I can remember six, but and so we wanted something that was simple. And we also wanted something that was relatively neutral. Most of the work in worldviews and deconstructing them is either in theological literature or scientific literature, and they make assumptions. So in theological literature, there's an assumption of a God. And chemists make some assumptions about the way the world is, and physicists make other assumptions. And we wanted to be relatively, well, mostly completely free of carrying in assumptions. And that's what Apostle did. And so he assembled a worldviews, people from around the world to create, which developed this framework, which we're going to work our way through, to use to deconstruct worldviews. And he did this because he was concerned in 1985 that the world was becoming increasingly fragmented way back then, and he wanted to find ways for people to talk to each other. So, Apostles' framework. Oh, and I just want to mention use of worldviews and the framework can help us shift the conversation from the personal to the worldview of the person itself. So the conversation isn't about Kathy or Jerry, it's about how we're seeing the world around us. Um, I facilitated a team discussion one time where there was a lot of conflict in the team and it was all directed at one person. And when we shifted the conversation from about that person to about the worldview, it found us a path to resolving the conflict. So it depersonalized the conversation. So there's 6 components in the framework: reality, history, future, value or values, practices, and knowledge. So reality is really those things that reflect our day-to-day experiences, and they also include our belief systems. So when we think about day-to-day experiences, those are things that are influenced by elements of our life. Do I have kids that I need to get off to school before I go to work? Am I a caregiver for a parent? Do I commute to work and back? Do I live in a rural area? Do I live in an urban area? They're affected by my skin color, by my age, by my gender, by my body type. Those are all parts of daily experiences that influence how we see the world. It's a story I like to tell is about, well, 2 stories I'll tell real quickly. One is about Alan Page, who some of you may have heard of. So Alan Page was a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, became a very successful attorney, became a Supreme Court justice in the state of Minnesota, one of the most highly regarded justices ever before he retired. But Alan Page was black. And so no matter how successful he was, when he would go into department stores, security guards would follow him around. So his daily experience was influenced, by his skin color. And he worked very hard to have a worldview that wasn't that didn't carry animosity or anger around that. And I think that's what made him such a successful Supreme Court justice. Another quick example, I grew up in a relatively small community and we ran pretty free. My kids were raised in a small community, 10,000, they could run pretty free. I was at my daughter's house one day and kids wanted to go out to play and she's like putting real boundaries on how far they can go and what they can do. And I almost said something to her, and then it occurred to me that she's raising kids in a town of 3.5 million people. And her worldview is very different. Her daily reality was than when I was raising her in a town of 10,000 people. So thankfully, I didn't say something. Another element I just want to mention is also our belief systems. So, what do we think is beautiful or ugly? What do we think about what's good or bad? What do we think about spirituality? Do we believe in one God or a multiple of gods? We do a lot of work with a Native American elder, and he talks about the Bison Nation and the Rock Nation and the Tree Nation. And his spirituality is very different. And that influences how he hosts and facilitates. And so those belief systems also are important to recognize. Another dimension is the history. What's been our history? What have been the influences in our lives? And it's interesting. We have an exercise we do around this with folks and inviting them to explore their influences. And it's really eye-opening for them to just, certainly a lot of people talk about parents and so on, but there's so many other experiences that one have had in life that have influenced them. I was in high school and college during the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and the birth of the environmental movement, and all of that very much influenced my worldview through all, even now today, throughout my entire life. But it can also include other experiences that we've had, events we've experienced, like the pandemic has influenced a lot of people, books we've read, movies we've seen. I think one of the things we try to be careful about is in situations is has there been trauma experienced by people in the room? And that causes us also to be careful about the language we use so that we don't, we've had experiences where innocent comments have brought forth trauma that people have experienced. It's in their history that we weren't aware of. So history plays a big role in all of this. And then the future. And this is really interesting because a lot of us really don't spend a lot of time thinking about the role of how we think about the future in our lives. So this really, in part, is what's our relationship with time? Are we really time sensitive, or are we, sort of time indifferent? Um, I'm by nature a planner. And so I'm one of those folks that if I'm going to be in a new town 6 months from now, I'm already looking at restaurants. Uh, and other folks are like, well, I'll just find one when I show up. And my being a planner, I find those folks are frustrating to me, and so my notion of the future is very different. Also, am I optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And if you do multicultural work, you might recognize that some people see past, present, and future existing simultaneously in time. And so that's another kind of approach to things. So how we what our relationship is to the future plays or others plays a big role. I do want to mention, and then Kathy's going to go, is one of the reasons we like these 6 dimensions is they kind of work horizontally. So I can use these same 6 dimensions to explore my worldview or your worldview or a team's worldview or a department's worldview, a community. And so then I can compare my worldview with the team's worldview or the department's worldview. And so we like that simplicity and that horizontal process. So Kathy's going to talk about the next 3 dimensions.
Well, and I would just say one of the reasons we want to compare worldviews is because we want to look for where there's alignment and points of connection and where there might be gaps or where the need for conversation might be. And one of the things that we do with the 6 dimensions framework when we're working with our clients is depending on the particular issue, we might pick a couple of them and invite people into exploration around them and then use the 6 dimensions to not just diagnose where the situation is, but to point to where we want to move to in the future. So values. Values are the core commitments that influence and guide us. We all have a set of values. We all have some notion of what our values might be. We make our decisions based on all of our choices are based on our values, whether we go with them or we go against them, and that has different influences and impacts in our lives. We'll often say we have some wiggle room in our values, as much as we might not like to admit that. But just a really simple example is if I ask you, is kindness something that you value? You may well say yes. Is honesty something that you value? You may well say yes. And then what happens when I come and go, like, I just got this brand new haircut. What do you think? And you're like, oh. And so then how do you respond? Do you respond kindly? Do you respond honestly? Or some element of being kindly honest. And it may well depend on the relationship as well. And that's just a simple example to help bring home the sometimes our values are in conflict with each other, and where do we go with that? When I think about the context of facilitation or hosting conversations, we bring our values and our principles to the facilitation and hosting roles that we're in, and we'll use them. We'll act according to them. And then also when we're in a group context, whether we're explicit about it or not, there are certain values or principles that we're expecting groups to be abiding by. Much better if we can be explicit about it than just make the assumption. And some examples for us, and sometimes with groups we call those rules of engagement or whatever we might want to call them. And for us, some of those values are things like bringing all of the voices into the room, using psychological safety. We don't usually these days talk so much about safe environments as much as we talk about supported environments so that we can be in the conversations that we need to be in. And then practices are how we live our lives and how we bring each aspect of our worldview to life. So what are our daily practices? Or what are the practices that show how we live our values? We think about practices in two ways. One is in the daily habitual kinds of practices. So we get up in the morning, we have a whole bunch of practices that govern how we begin our day. If we didn't have those, then we'd never get out of the house in the morning because we'd be thinking through everything all of the time. So habitual practices are things that comprise our day. We don't think about them. We just do them. It's just part of a routine. And then we think about intentional practices. And for me, this is something like I have a yoga practice and I have a meditation practice. But if I'm not intentional about bringing them into my day, I could reach the end of the day and not having done them. There are some people for whom an exercise practice is also habitual. So, they're not mutually exclusive, but intentional. We really have to be thoughtful about how we bring them in. And certainly when we're in a facilitation kind of role, we're thinking about what are the practices that we're bringing into the work that we're doing with our groups. And so we have practices that support our values. Things like a check-in is a practice that we use every time we're doing work with groups. And we might have practices that we have around how we address disagreements or conflicts. And we want to sometimes around conflict or potential differences of opinion, set an expectation for differences, deliberately invite opposing opinions, move people out of circular discussions by speaking about what we've heard, sometimes taking a break. When we're facilitating, these are all part of the practices that we might be drawing on in that situation. And then finally, we've got knowledge. Knowledge is this notion of, well, what sources of knowledge do we draw on? What sources of knowledge do we trust? And we know knowledge is a more specific word than information or data. We know there's a lot of information out there. It's not all knowledge, but what sources of knowledge we turn to influences our worldview. So if you just think about media, if we watch one set of media all the time or get all our news from there, it seems like we might have a very different reality than if we watch a different source of knowledge and get all of our information from there. And that speaks to some of the divisions and challenges and polarization that we're seeing in society today. Also, when we're thinking about the groups that we're working with or when we're facilitating, are there specific sources of knowledge or research that we're drawing on that is setting the stage for the conversation and or that we're gathering? Maybe we're using the facilitation to gather knowledge from the group as well. So kind of thinking about that. And then one of the questions that we ask about knowledge is, well, how do we know? How do we know what we know? And how do we know that what we know is actually true? And if we think about all of the 6 dimensions and think about it in relation to our own worldview, well, how do we know that our responses or our reflections on each of those dimensions are also true? And just a quick example from my own life, I've found out when I was in my mid 40s that I had been adopted, and I hadn't known that. So some of the historical aspects of my life or things from my history that I thought were true were not true, like where I was born, or why I was the shortest person in my family, or why my hair went gray at a very young age. Like these were all questions that I made up answers to. And then once you have something like that show up, it's an invitation into, how do I know what I know, and how do I know that it's actually true? So that's it for the 6 dimensions. Jerry mentioned that you can work with them horizontally, but you can see that we can also work with them interdependently. And you can think about your worldview from one of the dimensions, or from several of them, or from all of them. And you can think about them like I've tried to give you some examples around when we're facilitating or working with group dynamics, because we're thinking about all of these things whenever we're working with our clients and with the groups that we work with. And